Okay, Assalamu alaikum and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So thank you so much for joining us today for our second BRICOP 27 Global Summit. And today the title will be Climate Policy and Water Diplomacy. We are talking about the sustainable development diplomacy, which can be considered a successor of the notion of international environmental diplomacy and originates from the three parallel shifts in the international environmental politics, from environment to sustainability, from government to governance, and from classical to new diplomacy. And since the UNCED conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the so-called environmental problems can no longer be studied and managed in isolation. They need to be considered in their socio-economic and political context. And in other words, we need to focus on sustainability instead of the environment. And the non-state actors like NGOs and businesses have become ever more prominent in international politics and policymaking, which is expressed by the term governance. A similar development which can be observed in the world of international diplomacy. The so-called non-traditional diplomatic actors play crucial roles in sustainability diplomacy today. Without them, historical outcomes like the Paris Agreement on climate change can neither be understood nor achieved. So I'm inviting Dr. Achib for some opening remarks. Dr. Achib, the floor is yours. Dr. Achib, are you there? Okay, I think we can move to our first speaker, Ms. Miri Atalla. And Ms. Miri Atalla is from the United Nations. She will speak. She will be our first speaker. Ms. Miri?
Yes, hello. Hi, Dr. Wissam. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you very much, Jocelyn. Thank you very much.
The floor is yours. You might introduce yourself, and then you can start your presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. My name is Miri Atalla. I am head of the Nature for Climate branch in UNEP. I am based in Nairobi, and the work of my branch encompasses everything that is related to climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, in particular nature-based solutions, and climate finance. Dr. Wissam has kindly requested me to offer some freehand thoughts on climate diplomacy, experiences in that, and the evolution of where we are today with these issues and matters. We are still in 2022, meaning it is still 50 years after the Rio Convention. Earlier this year, in June 2022, there was the celebration. We all celebrated 50 years of the Rio Summit that gave rise to the three conventions. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. Some of the 50 years later, some of the stock take or some of the progress that we've seen spans. We've gone through a series of ebbs and flows, if I can put it this way, in terms of public diplomacy and environmental diplomacy. Obviously, in Rio, for I think quite a few of us around there were following Rio already at the time, the Rio Summit already at the time. For example, one of the things that we have that has not happened in Rio is that we did not have a convention on forests. We also, up until today, we do not have sufficient ratifications to have a convention on water. In the context of the UNFCCC today, what we are seeing also with the COP27 meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh happening soon, what we are seeing is that these issues actually come back into the agenda one way or another. So on forests, for example, in 2008, at the Bali COP, we saw the emergence of REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And what we have seen behind that is that because of the high potential of forests, and in particular tropical forests, to absorb and greenhouse gas emissions, in particular carbon, what we have seen is that we've increasingly gone towards what I like to call a carbon tunnel vision. So what in nature is not fragmented, we all know that a tree will not choose to stock carbon today, to retain soils tomorrow, to offer a nest for a endangered bird species after tomorrow, and to recycle water the day after. Nature itself is not fragmented. However, we, for intellectual purposes, for accountability purposes, for attribution purposes, and for funding purposes, we actually have fragmented nature conceptually. What we see happening today is, for example, during the UN Environment Assembly that was organized in February of this year, we saw the emergence of a definition of nature-based solutions that, for the very first time, which I think is not necessarily a coincidence, for the very first time, that definition looks at nature and nature-based solutions for climate from a water perspective, from a climate change adaptation perspective, from a climate change mitigation perspective, and from a biodiversity perspective. So that fragmentation, I think, is something that we are slowly losing. For those of you who track the funding streams on supporting environmental action, you will have seen, for example, that the Global Environment Facility is now calling more and more for integrated projects and programs. Similarly, the climate investment funds are doing so as well. So it does seem that we are learning from the experiences that we have gathered so far, and that we are acknowledging and recognizing that adopting a fragmented approach will not necessarily lead to, or will actually necessarily lead to fragmented action, and therefore loss of efficiency in terms of the actions that we undertake. Lastly, maybe a few thoughts. Dr. Wissam, if you can just hint to me for how much time I still have left. So maybe a couple of thoughts before, in conclusion.
Yeah, Ms. Mary, I think you can have 5 minutes more, okay, or even more than that. I mean, it's up to the presentation. Like, okay, in total, you can have like 20 minutes.
All right, thank you very much. So maybe in conclusion, a couple of thoughts and some questions to trigger a little bit of discussion and conversation among the group. First thought is on global governance systems. So far, the UN conventions have been primarily negotiated and discussed between governments. We have seen an increase in the recognition and the space and the role for civil society organizations, for private sector, and for different entities. A question to the group is whether or not global environmental diplomacy actually is strengthened by the participation of civil society organizations and non-state stakeholders, or whether, for example, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we anticipate that there will be a little bit over 20,000 people with a lot of side events. Does this actually create a distraction to the negotiators and pull the attention from negotiating the text, negotiating the hard issues, towards having this plethora of events and initiatives around? The tension and reinforcement between civil society advocacy maybe has also brought forward some critical achievements. We have the UN Secretary General has just launched the emissions gap report for 2022, where we see that we are way too far from even the commitments, let alone the action, to lead to the 1.5 degree of the Paris Agreement. He is calling for phasing out the Secretary General, and the emissions gap report are calling for not only phasing out fossil fuels, but also phasing out investment that lock us into an economy based on fossil fuels. In the past 10 years, we have seen civil society organizations that have started issuing the Fossil of the Day Award to countries that actually do not demonstrate high ambition on climate change. To what extent do you think that this challenge by civil society has actually contributed to pushing negotiators into more ambition? We currently also are in the decade of action, no longer in the decade of negotiations. And one of the things that we have seen, for instance, in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, is that we are adopting what we are calling the new power, where it's not only governments and the UN working together, but also, and no longer having a top-down trickle of what needs to be done and therefore trickling down to grassroots, but rather a very tense, a very interactive relationship between initiatives that are emerging from the grassroots, informing policy, and best practices that are being put together and then informing grassroots and civil society organizations in terms of what are the best practices and what can and cannot be, or what should or should not be done. So my big question to the group is, where do you see or where or how can we shift from an era of negotiation to an era of implementation and of action? Do we still need, in terms of environmental diplomacy, do we still need to create new goals, new text that's being negotiated, or rather should we shift towards an era of tracking implementation and holding entities accountable? And maybe my last question, I will try to tie back to the question of water, is that what we are seeing is that the harm that we are doing to nature, Earth is actually giving us back by punishing us with water, if I can put it this way, whether it's the extreme droughts that we have seen or the extreme floods that we are witnessing. Water is always the element that is most strongly manifesting the negative impacts that we are, or the negative imprint that we have on nature. And water is the big absent from all this environmental diplomacy. As I mentioned, we have not had sufficient ratifications for the Framework Convention on Water to enter into force. Water is acknowledged as an element of adaptation, as an element of mitigation in many contexts. We have the Ramsar Convention that has remained a non-UN convention, the Ramsar Convention on wetlands. So another question is, are we ready as a global community to actually agree on some of the things that are the most vital for the lifeline of humans, and that is water. So with this, Dr. Wissam, maybe I will leave it at that, and very happy to interact with the group, and thank you very much again for the invitation. Hello, Dr. Wissam?
Yes, I'm sorry. I've been disconnected. I'm not sure. I've been trying to add. So can you hear me, Miss Miri?
Yes, sorry, I have just concluded before you were able to reconnect, with a big thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just been, yeah, thank you so much. So I think we can move to the next speaker, and then we can open the floor for Q&A. So the next speaker will be Ms. Maysoon Al-Zu'bi. She's a policy associate at FAO. So Ms. Maysoon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wissam. Can I share my screen or somebody is sharing?
Yes, you're supposed to.
Somebody is sharing the screen, so I cannot share. Aisha, something.
Let me check.
So yeah, until you check. So thank you for
those who
me.
are sharing the screen, can you please stop sharing?
Yeah, this is, I think, Aisha, something, Aisha Youssef.
Aisha Youssef, can you please stop sharing for yours so that we can share, please, and make sure that